Thanks for tuning in to the Boundless Authenticity podcast. If you love this show, please like, share, and subscribe. Today is a first for Boundless Authenticity. I'm joined by co-host Dr. Nicole Dolan. And if you don't know who that is, where have you been? Check out our episode together called Chaos into Calm and drnicoledolan.com. And our guest is Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working with and studying the thought process and voices heard by psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. He was awarded the State of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award while working in the psychology department of a large state prison. He was also awarded the Pima College's Apple Award for the teaching of abnormal psychology. Jerry has held the position of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol and is a licensed commercial pilot, a certified scuba diver, and a long-distance motorcycle rider. His formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. He is co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. Visit Jerry's website at jerrymarzinsky.com. Read Jerry and Sherry's book, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, which can be found on Amazon, and learn about Sherry's That's a Lie program to fight back against the psychotic voices at keyholejourney.wordpress.com. Disclaimer. In this conversation, nothing that we say should be interpreted as being against psychology or psychiatry, but pro solutions for healing and thriving. Jerry, Nicole, how's it going?
Good. Thanks to be with you.
Yeah, we're glad to be here today.
So Jerry, I'll let you have the floor. Let's recap your story and talk about the MACE method.
I've been studying the voices that schizophrenics hear for 45 years or more. And, found after several years that they ran predictable, repeatable patterns. Now, the psychiatric mafia insists that these are auditory hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run patterns. Okay? And so I posted those patterns on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com under articles. So any of you who are working with schizophrenics or have schizophrenic sons or daughters or family members, you can go see these patterns yourself. So what psychiatry is doing is only treating the symptoms of schizophrenia. They're not getting at the cause. Schizophrenia is a spiritual malady. It's not a physical malady. They haven't found what psychiatry's done is it's incredible. They started out blaming mothers, saying mothers did something to mess their kids up and cause them to be schizophrenics. And the mothers went, what do we do? Where's the evidence? They didn't have any. So what they did is they kicked it up to genetics, where the average person and most researchers couldn't see. They go, oh, there's a genetic cause, mainly because they found that there's a 40% probability that identical twins with schizophrenia will have a schizophrenic offspring, 40%. And that's a correlation, okay? And correlation doesn't prove causation. It's a correlation. It could be caused by a million other things. You could say, hey, every schizophrenic has drank milk. You can make the point, hey, well, if they're all drinking milk and then they're schizophrenic, then milk causes schizophrenia. They're looking for a chemical cause, and there is no chemical cause. They back in the 70s, Eli Lilly made up this chemical imbalance thing. Got it here somewhere. So Eli Lilly, a chemical or drug manufacturer, came out with this chemical imbalance theory. They came out with it to sell Prozac, their new antidepressant. They didn't have a cause for schizophrenia, so they made one up, and that was the chemical balance theory. They figured, okay, these antidepressant drugs block the reuptake of serotonin, and supposedly that would cure depression. but it didn't. It didn't really work that well. So they came up with this chemical imbalance theory, and started teaching it, in the universities. So they taught it in the university. There was no proof for it. Again, Ronald Pius, a professor of psychiatry, said, I don't believe I've ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim that patients have a chemical imbalance, except perhaps to mock it. In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded or by any well-informed psychiatrists. So this all really started back in 1910 when the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Group sponsored something called the Flexner Report, which shut down any medical school outside of mainstream pharmacology. So if they weren't teaching pharmacology, they weren't allowed to graduate students into doctors. So the edict was so powerful that only a few medical schools survived it, such as Johns Hopkins and McGill and a handful of others connected with that group. They were the only schools that could legally license doctors. Any doctor caught doing anything else was fined and then thrown out of the group. And so here's the thing on Prozac. It was not until the late 1980s, after the release of the landmark antidepressant Prozac, that the idea of a chemical imbalance hit the psychiatric mainstream. As psychiatrist Peter Brigham pointed it out in 1991 in his book Toxic Psychiatry, the drug company Eli Lilly advanced the chemical imbalance theory as a marketing scheme to sell their new drug Prozac. There was no demonstrable evidence showing that depression and depressed patients had any chemical imbalance of their brain, but Lilly ran with it. Before long, psychiatrists and psychiatric patients alike came to identify with the idea that mental disorders are caused by a chemical imbalance. So that's one of the first things I saw when I took a job at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet, Central State Hospital, back in the 70s. They had brainwashed me into believing that schizophrenia and mental illness was a chemical imbalance also. So as I was bringing my patients into psychiatry's offices and kind of sitting with them through interviews at the state hospital, I noticed that these psychiatrists, not a single one of them, took any kind of baseline. They didn't do any kind of lab work. They didn't do any EEG, EKGs, any kind of objective test to determine what chemicals were out of balance or by how much, ever. What they did is they heard this patient's story and then they went, well, okay, you're bipolar, you're schizophrenic or whatever. And then they started them on some drug. And if that drug didn't work, they would either up it or lower it or add other drugs or do a combination of more drugs. They were always drugging the brain. And the patients I saw, after a while, they learned that if they told the psychiatrist anything, that I'm feeling, depressed or I'm hearing voices, that they were going to get drugged further. So they didn't tell them anything. They would tell me behind the scenes, oh yeah, I'm still hearing them, but they wouldn't tell psychiatry. Here they were operating under a false assumption. And their DSM, their Bible, their diagnostic Bible, there's not a single test for any one of the almost 300 psychiatric disorders in that DSM right now. Not one objective test for any of them. So it started out in 1952, they had 106 psychiatric disorders. 1980, they had 256. Now they have almost 300. So they're making up more every few years. They have a group of psychiatrists, 2/3 of which are aligned with the psychiatric, the big pharma. And they just determine whether they think they could make a drug for these diagnoses that they're making up. And some of these things are fairly ridiculous. They got one in there now called mathematics disorder. If you don't like math, you make poor grades in math, you're disordered. So these people aren't being straight up with the world's population.
I am curious to hear more about these patterns specifically and schizophrenia. And yeah, not to jump in, but I just wanted to clarify that because
no problem. They appeared slowly over a period of years because it took a while for me to understand how to relate to schizophrenics without scaring them. Because our job as masters, psychossociate kind of people, was to actually watch them and turn them into psychiatry if they were starting to get crazy. So they didn't trust us any more than they trusted the psychiatrist. So it took a while to kind of personally get to know them. And then I started, none of the staff at this giant hospital, there were over 200 buildings at that place. There were over 2,000 acres, and they had close to 10,000 patients when I got there. Every mental illness known to man was there. And, I was fascinated by neuropsychology, so I was like a kid in a candy store. So that everything was there. But the ones, I was working for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and our job was to get the highest functioning patients in the hospital, train them up and get them out of there, give them a vocational skill. And it turned out that, some of the most talented of the bunch were schizophrenics, but they wouldn't stay on their medications. So almost all of them went off their medications. And back then, that's the only thing we knew to treat them with. So we had kind of a rule at the rehab center: if a patient in classes went off his medications 3 times and went out of control, that we would have to discharge them and try to find somebody else who would stay on their medications, because that guy proved that he was not. And we talked to him, we tried to counsel him, but trying to counsel schizophrenics sometimes is like trying to shoot a rhino in the butt with a BB rifle to get it to move. I mean, they just don't respond to just regular counseling. I mean, they don't, these voices just overcome them. So I noticed that nobody was curious about what these voices were saying. There were hundreds of staff at this hospital, and none of them were interested in what these voices were telling these people. So when I got there, I thought, well, they're hallucinations. They're listening to word cabbage. It's word salad. It's not going to make any sense. But that's not what I saw. I saw patients walking around the wards, carrying on full-blown, coherent conversations with something or somebody I couldn't see. And it was like having, listening to a telephone conversation where you could hear what the guy's saying, but you couldn't hear what was coming in. Mm-hmm. So, I remember one incident where I snuck up behind one of those guys when I first got there, and he was a new patient that I hadn't seen before. And he was carrying on a pretty lively conversation with his voices, and I kind of tried to get close to see if I could hear what he was saying. And I remember years before that, a clinical psychologist wrote a paper saying that if 2 psychotic patients had the same disillusion or the same hallucination, that one of them would have to give way. So if they both thought they were Joe Biden, somebody would have to change into somebody else. Even as an undergraduate, I'm like, well, that makes no sense. Why would 2 crazy people have to change? I mean, I funneled that away. And fast forward about 7 years, I was on the 2nd floor of a large psychiatric unit, and I spotted this new guy. Like I was saying, he was carrying on a conversation with somebody or something that I couldn't see. It was a coherent conversation. I could hear it. I couldn't fully make out what he was saying. So I kind of snuck up behind him to kind of hear, and he kind of caught me. And I said, I haven't seen you before. Did you just arrive here? And he goes, yeah, I got here a few days ago. I said, what's your name? He said, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought back to that paper that I had to read in Abnormal Psych. And I looked him in the eye and I said, no, I'm Jesus Christ. And I'm like, okay, what's he going to do? I'm standing there waiting for him. And he cocks up his eyes and he thinks about it for a few minutes. And he looks me back in the eye. He goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he runs off happy. And I'm going, okay, what else did they lie to me about? So the second thing that came up when I saw that they weren't doing any baseline for a chemical imbalance They weren't taking any lab tests. They weren't doing any kind of tests. They were just subjectively diagnosing these people, and they were all doing that. There was no diagnostic test. It did not exist. It never had. They were just going with what this Eli Lilly company started, and then they started teaching it in the universities. And of course, it was pushed by the big pharma. It's a chemical imbalance, and our drugs fix it. So it was a lie, and it still is, and they're still pushing it. Only now they go, oh, it is believed. So I started asking these guys, what are these voices telling you? And some interesting stuff started coming out. Patterns started emerging. The first one was these voices were consistently and repeatedly derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. They never said anything good. It was always something bad. They were told the victims terrible stuff. You're ugly. You're stupid. You're crazy. Nobody likes you. Your parents have abandoned you. You're going to die. People are watching you. I mean, it was always bad, rotten stuff. So after interviewing scores of these patients about what the voices were telling them, I got caught. One of the patients got upset, or his voices got upset, and had him go tell psychiatry. Next morning, I ended up in that psychiatrist's office being dressed down, being told, you will not ask these people about their voices. They are hallucinations, and what you're doing is you're reinforcing those hallucinations by asking questions about them, and you're making the patients worse. Now, this is after 6 months of doing that. Nobody was getting any worse. It was just a crock of crap. But he warned me, he said, I'll catch you again. You'll face disciplinary procedures. So they didn't even want anybody looking at that. So that happened twice in my career while I was at Central State Hospital. So negativity was the first one that came out. And I'm thinking like, okay, if these things are consistently negative, why aren't they random? If hallucinations are random, they're all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're neutral. They're all over the place. Why are these things consistently negative? What holds them to that consistently negative pattern? Why aren't they random? So that was my first question with these. So I'm like, there's a pattern here. So I started looking for other patterns, and the second thing I found is, this was an inpatient psychiatric rehab center, and I was in charge of one floor. And I noticed that when the chaplain was doing ice cream socials in the auditorium, almost all the other patients went except the schizophrenics. They stayed on the dingy ward and stared there at the ceiling, or were watching horror movies, or staring at the ceiling, and that they wouldn't go. So I noticed that the first time, and I'm like, that's interesting. Second time I saw it again. Third time I started asking questions. They said, why aren't you down there with the chaplain and eating ice cream and cake, which was hard to come by at the psych hospital? And they said, well, I don't believe in God. I prayed to him a bunch of times, and he'd never helped me, and I don't think he's there. And I don't like preachers. I don't like churches. I don't want to deal with the Bible. They were anti-religious. So one patient came in one day, and he said, the voices attacked me last night, and I started reading the 23rd Psalm. And he said they reacted like worms thrown onto a hot frying pan. And I went, well, that's interesting. Let me see what happens with this. So I started asking my other patients what happened when they went to church, if they went to church, checking that out. And I started handing out the 23rd Psalm to them and saying, every time the voices come, repeat this and come back and tell me what happens in a week. Consistently, the voices hated it. They didn't want them saying it. They rebelled against it. They gave them headaches. They got louder. They started screaming. They did not like it. So that was interesting. Why would a hallucination be anti-religious? It didn't make any sense. So here was a second pattern, and it was true with scores of patients. So I started asking them, what happened when you went to church? And I found it broke up into 3 categories. If the voices were weak, they would shut up when the patient went into the church. If they were moderate in strength, they would gear up and they'd start screaming louder to block out whatever the preacher was saying. If the voices were very strong, they would actually drive them out of the church. The patient would get up and run out of the church. So that was the second pattern I saw, and it was a fixed pattern. You can ask schizophrenics about that. What do you feel about God? What do you feel about the Bible? Can you repeat the 23rd Psalm? The voices don't like it. It was consistent. The third pattern I saw was that a lot of these guys would report. Now, this I noticed at the state hospital. They report that after the voices attacked them, they didn't have any energy left whatsoever. And one of them said that he felt after being attacked by the voices at night, tossing and turning in bed, he said he felt like he was digging trenches in the hot sun all day. So that was consistent. After the voices attacked, virtually all of these people reported their energy level went down to almost nothing. There's a one-to-one correlation between the voices attacking and their energy leaving. But they didn't notice it because they were feeling so bad all around anyway. They weren't sleeping. The voices were screaming at them. But when you mentioned it to them, they would think back to it and they go, yeah, come to think of it. And you'd ask them, well, where do you think your energy went? And they went, well, I don't know. And so, well, it happened every time the voices come, right? You go, yeah. And okay. Well, you've heard these voices thousands of times, and every time they came, you pretty much felt drained, right? You go, yeah. Well, what do you think's draining you? I don't know. The vast majority, I'd say 80% of them would say, I don't know. And I'd say, okay, if you were sitting around a fire and you stuck your fist in that fire 100 times, and every time you got burned, what was burning you? They had no trouble with the fire. But if you say, okay, these voices have come thousands of times in your lifetime, and every time that they've come, you were drained, what was draining you? I don't know. They couldn't get it. They were being blocked from getting it. And when it was explained to them, their voices would get very upset. Later on, when I was the last 10 years of my when I was working in hospital emergency rooms throughout Tucson doing psych crisis. And they didn't want you working with patients in there. They wanted you to do the psych eval, a diagnosis, and figure out what to do with that person to get them out of the emergency room. The doctors didn't like dealing with psych patients because they didn't know what to do with them. They just wanted them out. Get them out of my emergency room so I can work with real medical patients. So what I did back then, I was like, what can I tell these people that would help them the most without getting caught by psychiatry? And, because I knew if psychiatry knew what I knew, or they'd already warned me not to be talking to these guys about their hallucinations. And the two things that they need right off the bat is to understand that these voices are not them. They don't come from them. They're not their mind. They come from outside of them. And, you think about that. Everybody gets hit by these things. You're walking along, you have this intrusive thought telling you to do something that you would never do. You would never act on it. And everybody has those. These things are hitting everybody, not just schizophrenics, but they hit schizophrenics constantly. They're trying to get them in more trouble. The more trouble they get them into, they generate that negative emotional energy. That's what these things feed off of. That's why they don't like the Bible. They don't like anything positive. They don't like church. That's moving in the wrong direction. So these things feed off of negative emotion. They're what they call the archons. And they put negative thoughts into the schizophrenic's thought stream. They put thoughts in all our thought streams, but schizophrenics is constant. This guy's looking at you, they're following you, they're laughing at you. They call it ideas of reference. But where do those thoughts come from? They don't originate. Nobody's ever found a thought in anybody's brain. And here's psychiatry going, oh yeah, those are just ideas of reference, which is what they are. But they don't ever talk about where thoughts come from, how they originate. They just assume today, people assume every thought that you have that runs through your mind belongs to you. That's not true. That's not anywhere near true. A lot of those thoughts come from other places. Manuel Swedenborg, who lived some 300 years ago, he said, none of your thoughts are yours. They either come in from heaven or hell. Any questions so far? We got like 23 other patterns.
In your perception, there's some kind of spiritual strength that the diagnosed schizophrenics have that these entities prefer to feed on, that it seems to attack them, or is it that they're weaker?
They're weaker. See, they go after the most wounded. If you look at the history or the family history of these people, a lot of them, a majority of them are physically, emotionally, sexually abused. There's a lot of trauma in their background. So these voices are low frequency creatures. They're like sharks that swim around in the ocean and smell blood. They can tell when somebody's in pain and hurting, and they jump in there and they just feed it. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. They're only interested. They could care less about the person. All they want is that negative emotional energy. That's what they feed off of.
I'm sure you'll cover this, but is that the reason why many people go to like an ayahuasca retreat and come back with these voices?
What that happened? And I just got two emails from people who did that. They went to the ayahuasca retreat and they came back with voices. Now, there's some drugs that open people up, okay, and methamphetamine is one of them. I've seen more people in the prison go crazy on methamphetamine than any other drug. Second in line was cocaine, but meth was number one. The prisoners called it the devil's drug because it let these things in. So the way it would progress was they'd be taking their meth, and some of them started off on Ritalin and Adderall prescribed by psychiatrists. Oh yeah, you're ADHD, take this stuff, and they liked it, and they just kept going up and up and up. And I'd ask them, you were feeling good on the Ritalin, why did you keep going up to meth? And well, I thought taking more meth I'd feel even better. And they ended up committing some crime and ending up in prison. And what was interesting is the voices would tell meth addicts where to go and when to be there to find more meth when they ran out. And they would go there and some stranger would show up with the meth. I've heard story after story after story of that, where they tell them where to go to get more. And these are non-physical beings, telling them that. So the way it would start out, they'd start using the meth, and then after a while, they'd start hearing voices while they were high. And they'd go, oh, that's just a hallucination. And then they'd come down and the voices would go away. And that might happen, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 times. And then one day, they don't go away. They're there for life, and they can't get rid of them. They're just as psychotic as anybody in the state hospital.
Yeah,
it opens the person up. It spiritually opens them up to these things, and it's like you give them the opportunity to get in there, and they're there.
Yeah, I've certainly heard that before, right? As far as like some people might use the language attachments, right? That will have certain entities or energy that will attach.
Yes.
So I want to jump in and kind of ground just from what I'm holding over here, which is, so I'm a clinical director. So I actually teach therapists on their way to become licensed. So really familiar with like DSM and that world. I'm also a mother of an autistic child, which took me on a very lengthy journey from being a deeply holistic spiritual practitioner, which I still am, but being somebody who at one point needed to use medication as a resource to help with some things. So I just want to kind of ground and just say, like, I might be holding, I don't know if I'd say like opposing views by any means, but like I might be holding something over here that I think it's worth just kind of like sharing as part of the conversation.
Yeah, well,
And then
don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, yeah, I've worked in psychiatric hospitals long enough to know that there's some patients that the only way you can control those suckers is with these meds. Same way in the prison. And even with therapy, with schizophrenics, even though we're using MACE, which is an energetic psychotherapy, some of them have to be calmed down to the point where they can concentrate well enough where you can get to them.
Yeah,
the voices are screaming in their head. They can't hear anything you're saying. I'm not saying it's useless, but what these guys are saying, you got to take this for the rest of your life. This is a life sentence. That's bullcrap.
Yeah. And I'm not jumping in to contradict anything you're saying. I'm just kind of grounding because we're new to each other. So I just kind of want to ground and say, like, this is where I am, just so you know. And then something that is of curiosity to me, though, as somebody who has trained many therapists on their way to licensure and from a very holistic and spiritual perspective, is so I want to say first, I don't have a lot of experience of working with schizophrenia. And that's because I've been mostly in a private practice realm, nonprofit, training on a level in which these patients are not appropriate for, right? Though I have worked with a couple, and I do have other people underneath my license who have worked with them before. And the thing that I'm really resonating with is that, and I've always said to them without an answer, is that they do come in with these patterns, right? They tell the same story, which is really what's quite interesting about it, is because it's like, it can't be, to your point, just a hallucination. I mean, I don't want to go so far as say it can't be, but it does make you question the story, the fact, whatever, that it's a hallucination when they're telling the same story, right? When they have a lot of the same experiences, when they're sharing the same patterns. And so I find curiosity about that and what you're speaking about there.
Yeah, there's hundreds of them I spoke to, and not just at Central State Hospital. I mean, I was working in Georgia over there at the big state hospital. Then I came over here and I was working in mental health centers. I was working in the last 10 years I spent in hospital emergency rooms doing psych crisis. I spent 18 years working with the criminally insane in the Arizona State Prison. And these patterns were consistent. And now I'm working worldwide. This MACE psychiatry, or the energetic psychotherapy. It's probably something you've never heard of.
Yeah. So well, I am very familiar with energetic psychotherapy, but I have not heard of MACE, and I'm very excited to hear. But I want to ask you another question first, or bring something else in too, is what's been really interesting is, I would say, over the last few years, and this could certainly follow what you're sharing before as far as like attachment, energy, etc., is I think we're seeing this, to your point, in people that are not necessarily diagnosed schizophrenia. And specifically, I feel like we're seeing this in people who are on the spectrum more, which kind of in my realm means, well, they're very highly sensitive. Like, I think those of us that are on the spectrum are very highly sensitive beings, but those are not your beings who are maybe being chosen, attached to, or struggling in these ways that you're saying due to trauma and due to low frequency, which I think is actually kind of interesting, because there was a point for sure. I never had the answers for schizophrenia. I'm always somebody, I will say first and foremost, that just stood back and said, I don't really know. I'm curious, and I'm curious about the patterning, because that doesn't make a lot of sense from a DSM perspective, like you're saying. But I don't really know. So I've never claimed to know. But it's been interesting to see more and more patients come in and say, I'm hearing these voices, and not have those trauma histories.
That happens sometimes. It happens with drugs. But I'd say for the most part, it's much rarer than those who have trauma histories. Now, I know very little
I'm talking kids too.
Oh, kids. You know what surprised me is when I was working in the ER, because up to that point, and before I worked in the ERs, it was all adults. You know, at the state hospital, at the prison, it was all adults. Once I started working in the hospital ERs, I got called to the pediatric units several times to see kids who were psychotic, and it just blew me away. It's like they're little, they're 7, 8, 10 years old, and here's these psychotic symptoms in these kids. I couldn't fathom it. It still amazes me. And I'm like, where did that come from? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, they weren't being abused as far as I could tell.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to that. It just amazed me. It's like, wow, I've never seen this before. And I don't know hardly anything about autism. I got a friend who has, his son has 2 autistic kids, and he tells me some of the stories he's dealing with. I have no idea what to do with autistic kids. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what causes it. I've never worked with them. I'm like a complete, like you are with schizophrenia. I don't know. I don't know anything about those guys. But just to run through the, I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'm just going to run through some of the rest of these patterns. So these things energetically drain their victims. They get louder after sunset. Once the sun goes down, they get louder and more vociferous. It's like, and it's consistent. They get loudest between 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning. I remember one time when I was sitting in a psychiatrist's office, the patient was complaining about his voices, and the psychiatrist said, "Oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations." And I went, "Well, I don't know." So I called that guy back a week later, and I said, I was with you when the psychiatrist told you to ignore those voices. I said, "How'd that go for you?" He said, "It didn't go well at all. They got louder." And that was consistent too. When I started asking schizophrenic patients, what happened when you ignore them? They consistently get louder. They don't want to be ignored. They won't be ignored. So they foster self-destructive behavior. They get these people to sabotage themselves, to act out, to say stuff that they didn't mean. They're constantly sabotaging them. And that creates more of that negative energy. So when they sabotage themselves, there was, one gal, she was doing great in cosmetology class. She went off her meds a 3rd time because the voices were telling her that she was being poisoned by the psychiatrist. And it feels like they're being poisoned. I mean, the side effects of those drugs are absolutely horrible. Here's some of them. These are antipsychotic drugs: dizziness, drowsiness, anxiety, sleep problems, insomnia, breast swelling or discharge, changes to the menstrual cycle, weight gain, swelling of the hands and feet, dry mouth, stuffy nose, blurred vision, constipation, and a whole bunch more. Uncontrolled muscle movements, chewing, lip smacking, stiffness of the neck, tightness of the throat, trouble breathing or swallowing, lightheaded feeling like you might pass out, confusion, agitation, feeling jittery, trouble sleeping, weakness, breast discharge, seizures, jaundice, white blood cell counts it just goes on and on. I think another page of it. Right? So these guys are being poisoned. Those are toxic effects of these antipsychotic drugs. These are not healthful things. Those are due to the side effects of these drugs, not toxic side effects. And what they found later when they started doing autopsies on some of these long-term state hospital patients that are on these drugs, they found that their brains were shrunk like walnuts. And when they brought that out, the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts and went, no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing this. It's schizophrenia, it's causing that. So the researchers didn't buy that. They started feeding it to rats and monkeys and mice, and they found that their brains were shrunk also. So these guys are doing permanent neurological damage to these patients and telling them that there's no other treatment for schizophrenia than these toxic drugs, and that they have to take them for the rest of their lives. I don't know how many times I've heard that. So the voices get louder when ignored. They foster self-destructive behavior. They foster isolation. They want that person shut up in their room by themselves with no other contact than the voices. Anybody who tries to help them is an enemy. So the voices will tell the patient, oh, they're plotting against you. They really don't like you. They're just, do everything. And they get the patient to act out. So these poor parents go, yeah, go to your room and get away from me. Just close the door, get in there. And then they're sitting in there. You can hear them arguing with the voices in there. That's the worst thing that you can do, is leave them to their voices alone. But parents are considered enemies by the voices. The voices want to drive those parents away. The voices demand the attention of the victim. Like I said, they won't be ignored. They maneuver for increased control over the victim. Step by step, they want to take more and more control. They gaslight the patients. There was one psychiatric patient I knew. He was hearing voices, and the voices had convinced him that he murdered somebody. Now, he didn't know whether he did or not because he was very confused. So he thought about going to the police station and telling them that he might have murdered somebody, but he decided against that because they would lock him up or send him to a psych hospital. Right. Now, the other problem he had is every time he heard a police siren or an ambulance siren, the voices would start screaming, they're coming for you, they're coming for you. So they had him in a catch-22. They were gaslighting. They do that with patients constantly. They manipulate their perception. Always negative. So the guy might be walking down the street and some guys across the street crack a joke and they start laughing. They'll tell them they're laughing at you. Okay. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. They can go in there because these are energetic entities. Your thoughts are energy, your feelings are energy, your spirit is energy, you're an energetic being. Okay. So these things move right in. They can get into that energy field, and they know all the rotten stuff that you've ever done. So they can bring that up and start rubbing it in your face. So they can access those memories. They don't want the victim to tell anybody else about the voices. They don't want anybody else to know. And the voices are technically not allowed to speak to them. And I've been told that if they do speak to somebody outside the schizophrenic, that they're punished by these entities who are above them. They're consummate liars. You can't believe anything they say. There's one case where I remember the voices told this one psychotic patient, if you gouge out your eye, we will disappear and we'll never come back. The guy gouged out his eye, and they came right back and started laughing at him and mocking him and telling him now he's a monster. Nobody going to stand being able to look at him, that he's an outcast. And they just, this is the kind of things they are. They are very negative, nasty things. They don't like the patient feeling joy or pleasure. They don't let them watch comedy. They don't want them watching anything that feels good. They want them watching war movies and murder mysteries and that kind of stuff. That feeds them. Okay, they can manipulate feeling without speaking. I mean, there's been times where I'm feeling okay, and then all of a sudden I get this pall, and I'm like, well, where did that come from? And I found the patients feel the same things. It comes out of nowhere. There's no cause for it. They short circuit reason. You can't really reason with these people. Boredom is bad because if you let the patient get bored, these things move in. They try to pass themselves as thoughts belonging to the victim. Right? So I've had a number of prisoners ask them, like, who are you? What are you? And they would say, we are you. So they want them to think that those thoughts that these things are putting in their head are coming from them. And that's basically what psychiatry is telling them. They're your uncontrolled thoughts. They're hallucinations, and you're stuck with these things, and the only thing you can do is take these toxic drugs. So they will try to pass them off as yourself. They want you to believe that those voices you hear are you. And everybody knows, you can be just minding your own business, and all of a sudden this intrusive thought just blows up in your head to do something you would never do. You wouldn't even think about it. You go, where did that come from? That comes from them. They can do selective forgetting. So, when I give these guys the 23rd Psalm, or I gave them the That's a Lie program, or stuff that would help them out, they would forget to use it, or they would lose it. And that was pretty consistent. They fill the victim's mind with negative thoughts about themselves and everybody else. They will destroy any remnants of positive self-concept they have. They'll attempt to pull the patient away from consensual reality, which is the reality we all operate on. They feel like they're living in another world almost. They use confusion as a means of instilling negative suggestions. So they'll do something to confuse the patient, and then they'll give some kind of bad suggestion because people don't like that confusion, and they latch on to whatever that suggestion was. It's the same thing hypnotists do. They're averse to anything positive or beautiful. They don't like the victim. They don't like the victim being told that they are energetic parasitic entities. They get very nasty and animated when you tell them that. So, if you're talking to a schizophrenic, you go to tell him that, you expect some kickback from the voices. So those are basically the patterns. And these have been substantiated over and over and over again. Now I'm working with people all over the world via Zoom. Same patterns. It's consistent. They're there. So, hallucinations don't run patterns. And these are things you can see for yourself. Go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, copy the patterns, ask your schizophrenic patient or your husband or wife or whoever schizophrenic, do they run these patterns? Do the voices run and you'll see they do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, the weirdest thing to me is that between our first chat in 2023 and now in 2025, Jerry, I've seen a lot of those patterns emerge in undiagnosed schizophrenics. And so to Nicole's point, people who didn't have any trauma, you go through the gamut, you can't find anything there particularly traumatizing, but it has been in their influences, what they're consuming, a lot of negativity via the news, constant, just addiction to watching fear porn, basically, or
constant 24 hours.
Yeah, or dark romantic movies where there's no resolution to their relationships, really just drama, things like that. Horror movies, The Walking Dead, things like that. Also, their diet is so toxic. So I was wondering, is there a correlation between a desire to kill the body that weakens the mind? So they're just consuming all this fast food and they have all these reasons why they can't eat healthy and things like that. Or these are things I've noticed. And they're having these, things telling them, I don't know why I was even born. I should just kill myself. And, sometimes getting into the specifics, slip my wrist, walk into oncoming traffic.
50,000 people in the United States kill themselves every year. Where do those thoughts come from? And a good many of those people are on antidepressant and antipsychotic drugs. So, where do thoughts come from for those people to kill themselves? That's a lot of people.
I think certainly, I think definitely for me, I have to ground in intrusive thoughts as part of post-traumatic stress. I certainly see that. I find myself genuinely curious about people who kind of what you're saying, Jehan, as far as there's so many people, we're seeing it more and more that people are having symptoms like this or saying things like this, having, real repercussions of negativity and self-concept issues without necessarily having the correlated trauma history, which is interesting, especially for, a trauma therapist like myself. It's like, wait, hold on. Why is that happening? Because that's not typically the type of person that happens to, or like I said, kids. Like we're seeing this stuff in kids where it's just like, whoa. And I don't have the answer for it, just being curious. I've leaned into the idea of maybe there's just such high anxiety here that there could actually be audible hallucinations. But I've never had
that's one of the patterns I've noticed is that their present circumstances is very stressful, and it continues
they're
to get
high
more stressful as they are, unable to see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. It seems to weaken them. And so they're coming to me for self-sabotage issues. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe it might not be so much yourself as it might be something otherworldly.
Yeah. That's interesting too, like the energy of chaos, really, because we are, as a culture and as a world, in a state of chaos. And that too is an energy. And so if you kind of think of it as like a vortex almost, and we're experiencing that on, micro levels, how, of course we're impacted by the world, but we're also experiencing chaos in our own lives, just in different ways. Like that's what we are in. And then of course, collectively. So that to me is interesting too, to kind of lean into and be curious about, energetically what's happening to us as we live in such great chaos.
Well, let me tell you about MACE. Again, it's an energetic psychotherapy. Okay?
Sure.
I dropped my license on purpose years ago because I knew they would go after me. For saying what I'm saying. I knew it. So, I got a good, clean record now. Somebody did a grok check on me, and my record's still clean. So they didn't dirty it up because I was out of their control before they could. But I've been looking for a therapy that would work my entire life. I've been deluged with hundreds of hours of in-service training, undergraduate, master's degree counseling, 2 years in a PhD program. Nothing worked well. It didn't work well. It didn't work quick. Finally, I stumbled on MACE. Somebody wrote me one day and said, "Hey, I got somebody you need to meet." And at worst, she'd be just like a jolly old grandma. And that's not the kind of email I usually get. So I'm like, I was curious about that. I'm like, oh, okay, I got to meet a jolly old grandma. I wonder what that's about. It wasn't anything negative. I'm usually getting, "Hey, help me out. The voices are killing me." And so I checked it out. It turned out that she was the chief MACE instructor for MACE psychotherapy in Australia. And we had several, long talks. And I went and I got the books. John Mace wrote 2 books. Now, John Mace was the guy who came up with this. He was a ship captain. He wasn't anything to do with psychology or social work or counseling or anything. I think he got his master's in counseling later but he already had this theory going before then. So he drove these big ships back and forth across the ocean, and he had to be, he had to facilitate the use of all kinds of different energy, navigational energy, star energy, gravity, tides, the ship engines, the currents, all these different electrical energy. He had all this energies that he had to keep dealing with. So he found that energy flows from negative to positive. And he always wanted to know what made the mind work. What made the human mind work? And he read all kinds of philosophies, and he had nothing to do but read on a lot of these voyages across the ocean. So he read hundreds of books, and he was putting together this theory, and then he would test it out with once he got his counseling degree. And the bottom line was the flow of energy. Okay? So, like I was saying earlier, your thoughts are energy, your feelings are energy, your spirit is energy, you're an energetic being. Everything about you is energy, and all psychiatry is doing is dumping drugs on your brain and treating the symptoms of whatever and gorking you out, turning you into a zombie in the meantime. It's not curing anything. They're not curing nothing. So what Mace found was that a great deal of psychological problems, matter of fact, most of them come from some kind of trauma. And what happens in a trauma is you get this horrible feeling that just stays there forever, and it just torments you. And you're like, something happened, and you're thinking about it over and over and over again. It goes on for days, may go on for weeks. And there's a decision that you make at the time of that trauma as to what part you played in that trauma, or who are you as a result of that trauma. The two things happen simultaneously. So after a while, the ego shows up and goes, hey, this isn't working out. You can't concentrate. You're feeling bad all the time. This isn't going away. Let me handle it. And it takes it and it throws it into your subconscious and it locks it down. So after that, it's no longer available to you. And that's where that's saying, oh, time cures all woes. No, the ego throws it up into your subconscious, locks it down. It wants to get out. It's a body of negative energy with a decision attached to it. And it wants to break out. What it works, once it's locked down like that, it works like a landmine. Okay. So when anybody shows up in your psychological sphere that is similar to that person who traumatized you and caused that trauma, this thing goes off like a landmine. It just boom, it goes. And it tells you either attack that person or run away from them or avoid them. So this is like the person you hate. They keep showing up over and over in your life. No matter where you go, you can go from here to China and that person will show up. It'll be a Chinese person like that. Right? So it's sitting there, and every time it fires off, it gets stronger. And every time it fires off, you believe more and more that that's who you are, that trait, that characteristic is just who you are, and you just accept it. Okay, but it's not. It's in the subconscious. It's there. It's causing you to misjudge the world around you. It affects what you think. It affects what you do. It affects what you don't do. It affects what you say. It affects what you don't say. It affects your attitude. It affects your emotions. It's dark energy that's stuck there, and it takes energy to keep it there. Okay, so out of your limited amount of energy, it requires energy to keep it there. So what Mace did was create a structure using the attention, okay? Where now he doesn't come out and say this, but what they said in training behind it's not obvious, is that your spirit will absorb negative energy if it is connected to it. So what Mace has done is he has figured out a way to use the attention to connect that negative emotional energy to the spirit via an image, okay, that represents it. And the spirit will slowly dissolve it until it's gone. So what's happening is kind of the same thing when you get a car battery and you charge it up full. And then if you bring it down to no charge, you take all the electricity out of it, that battery is dead. You can't charge it up again. It's a boat anchor. Well, it's the same thing with this negative identity. Once it is drained down to nothing, okay, it ceases to exist except you remember that it happened, but there is no emotional charge to it. So it's no longer a factor. It's gone. Now, when you run into somebody who is like this person who abused you, the response is much more rational and not emotional. And that can happen within an hour. It's gone. These guys are feeling lighter, stronger, more grounded. And you go, okay, now go back to this trauma where you were sexually abused or whatever. How do you feel about it now? Nothing. It's like, okay, I remember it, but there's no emotional charge to it. It's gone.
Yeah, sure. So you're speaking about this specifically there's a lot of different ways that we can work with trauma, and you're speaking about it from an energetic perspective, yes, specifically Mace. Curious, couple questions. One is, what does that look like? And two, tell us some of your success stories, because I imagine you have been the person to apply this with schizophrenia.
Yeah, there's a small group of us who are doing that. Now, I'm not saying it works great with schizophrenia. I think right now we're getting maybe a 30% success rate, and there's some Mace therapists who are also deliverance ministers, so there's a gray zone between what's a negative identity. So what I was talking to you about which is stuck in your subconscious. Mace calls that a negative identity. Right? It's an identity you gained via the trauma, and the biggest, most common one is I'm worthless. This thing happened to me and I'm worthless. It's number one. I'm worthless, or I'm stupid. But there was one last week. This lady was in Serbia. She just got out of a psychiatric hospital after 3 months. They had drugged her up pretty well. She was on like 10 milligrams of risperidone and olanzapam and something else. There were like three drugs, and you could tell she was drugged up, but she was still coherent. I mean, she wasn't slurring her words. She could listen to instructions, and when we were done, that voice was gone, and she said, "The silence is deafening." She hadn't heard silence in decades. And it was gone. Now that's rare. So what's confusing some of us now is the difference between a negative entity and a negative identity. So what she had was a negative entity. And she just got out of the hospital. She was hearing those voices when we started. When we finished, they were completely gone. I mean, that doesn't always happen. A lot of times what happens is the voice will kick up and give them headaches and say, don't listen to that jerk. He's crazy. He's stupid. They would stop them. The person has to be able to form an image that represents that the traits of that negative identity. And then the image is dissolved. Okay?
So would you say you work with it symbolically in a way? It's making me think of, so I'm a depth psychologist, so I'm Carl Jung background trained. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jung's work.
Yeah, I liked Jung.
Yeah. So even when I was very first learning how to do therapy, it was the only thing I was taught. So I didn't know that I wasn't learning like CBT and all the things that other people that were, 90% of America, 99% of America were learning. But my school was actually teaching me how to work with symbols, imagery, the unconscious, dreams. And so that's what I'm thinking about when you share that. I'm like, oh, okay, it sounds very, not to say it's Jungian, but, Jung would agree that you can certainly work with imagery.
Yeah, imagery is a big part of it. Matter of fact, if they cannot form an image, MACE doesn't work at all. They have to be able to form an image of the traits of that negative identity. They can't do that, it doesn't work.
Okay, so they created an image, and then do you guys work with? How do you work to take the? Do you work to take the charge out of that image?
Yeah, we work to take the charge out of that image and get rid of that image. Now, I can't give you a whole lot of information because they made me sign all these 5-10 pages of stuff that I wouldn't reveal. That I've probably gone too far now. But Mace wrote 2 books. One called Causism, because it gets to the cause of the mental illness, and Energy Over Mind. Okay? There's enough information in those 2 books with your training to be able to begin to put it to use in a rudimentary way.
This is really fascinating and validating for me as well, because a lot of the stuff that I do is around imagery as well. And I found that in a lot of cases, that's the only thing that helps people move past certain hurdles. And I just try to get people to a point where they're in charge of their own healing, and I don't have to babysit them so much, like they don't have to rely on me every time there's a challenge, and they can learn to do it on their own, just learning how to control their visual faculties, essentially.
Sure. And I would add their nervous system, right? Creating capacity to be able to be with really difficult emotions and feelings of aloneness. And certainly if they have voices coming in on top of that, then that's even more challenging.
And emotions are energy also.
Yeah. And that is true. And a lot of people actually see these different colors and like webs of energy and things like that they describe around them when we're doing the internal work. But I also know that, limbic system plays such a big role in it. So for a lot of these people, they can't access any of their higher energetic capacity unless we do some real brainstorming around what are the things that they're putting in that cause them to stay in an agitated state. Even as soon as they wake up, some people just drink 2 or 3 cups of coffee and they are allergic to that much caffeine all at once. And so they can't self-regulate or do anything, or they can't even get out of circular thinking, So there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of addiction and stuff that goes into a lot of these cases as well too. But this is really validating to hear, what you're saying.
Now, you ought to check out those 2 books, because I've never seen anything work as well or as quickly as this system. Like I said, I've been through hundreds of hours of in-service training, through the master's counseling program. Nothing there worked anywhere near this well. And the PhD was even worse. I mean, they were further out than even the master's people. So I've never seen anything.
I think the 3 of us can agree that certainly there's an energetic component to the work, which sounds kind of silly because we all know that energy is everything.
Yeah.
But I think for the mainstream that's kind of waking up to that a little bit more, I think that the language, there is an energetic component to doing your healing work is starting to resonate more and more with people. I'm still a deeply valuing human of psychology and what it's taught me as far as like nervous system imprinting and how do we stay in our body and how do we move through trauma and the things that we can do from that knowledge and insight, and also soma, body work. But the energetic component is absolutely necessary. It's definitely a part that if you want to be able to shift, transform, and alchemize that energy, right? Like taking that energy from negative to positive, like you were saying, then this is a part that we do need to be bringing in to the work.
And that's what it does. Once that system is set up to move that negative energy toward the spirit doesn't get rid of it. It changes it into positive potential. So the patient feels more energy when they're done for 2 reasons. One is they have that negative energy has been transposed into positive, and how that's done, I have no idea. But it happens. Like magic, it happens.
I don't think anyone can really pinpoint how the transmutation of energy works. But I liked when Nicole mentioned the somatic element too, because in several instances, as I'm thinking about it, persons who were suffering from these alleged auditory hallucinations were also able to point to specific parts of their body where they were hanging on to things. So that's interesting too.
Yeah.
We do a run at the finish, starting at the top of the head, going down and looking for whatever anxiety is in the body. And it's amazing how much garbage is trapped, especially at the solar plexus level. You turn that into an image and then run it. And once it's gone, they feel it's gone. They feel it's gone.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's so many ways that we can do this work, deeply honoring your system too. I'm just thinking about, I was talking to a friend the other day and I'm going to try and remember the exact language, but just basically we're all talking about the same thing. Like we're all kind of holding a piece of the pie and we're trying to come together with each other so that we can put all these things together. And I even think that, when it comes to even the psych world, even psychiatrists, it's like the psychiatrist is not necessarily the enemy. It might be the people who's passing down the rules and like teaching them, right? But there's a lot of really good people out there that are trying to do their best and are coming from like heart and service. But we're all just trying to like gather the pieces and put them together. And so something I'm really, really grateful for is I think that this is really rising in the collective. What's his name? Richard Schwartz's work with internal family systems is he's starting to now even come forward and say like, this is a spiritual practice. We're talking about, energetic beings or states that are part of us. It's kind of like taking inner child work from therapy and putting it into the spiritual world, right? Like we're paying attention to parts of self as real parts of self, real beings with real feelings and emotions and traumas and behaviors, and working with those beings. So whether it's MACE or IFS, or I'm trained in something called LCT, which is fascinating. I should get someone on your show for you, Jayon, because I don't know how it works either exactly. But I mean, we've learned how to muscle test people down to figuring out, did this trauma happen in this life, another life, or how old were you before we even go in to work with the trauma? So there's some fascinating stuff out there, and I appreciate hearing about this. I'm gonna read about it.
Well, yeah, that muscle testing stuff I found fascinating too, because it's another thing, that works, and you can see it works. You get a Tylenol tab, but test the person without the Tylenol tab. Put his arm straight out, tell him to don't not let it down. Okay? You get that Tylenol tab and you put it over the fifth chakra, and man, that arm goes down like a wet noodle. Then you get a crystal and you put a quartz crystal in front of that Tylenol tab, and then put the Tylenol tab on the quartz crystal, and the Tylenol tab no longer has an effect. So you can test virtually anything that's bad for the person by putting a little bit of it under their tongue and doing the strength testing.
Sure. Yeah. And I think there's people that can do it at all different levels. I have a friend who has taught me how to energy test, but she's so brilliant at it that sometimes I just let her do it for me, because she's deeply confident in, caring for her child in that way, where it's like, hey, does my kid need this today? And she's able to really trust that answer. So I think there's a lot of beauty in us all really waking up and realizing that we have a lot of tools and resources at our disposal.
Like I was saying, I haven't seen anything quicker than MACE. It's fast, in an hour. Yeah. These major traumas, and it's kind of heart-rendering to some of these people, like 65, 70, 75 years old, that something happened to them when they were 6 years old. Something, their dad did something or their mom did something, and they got that feeling like I'm worthless, or I'm stupid. Or, and they've been carrying that identity around for their entire lives.
Yeah.
And inside of an hour, it's gone. And you could just see them. They just light up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's more information on MACE on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, along with several testimonies by schizophrenics who fully recovered, who are asserting that these voices are not hallucinations.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm going to send you people.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to tell you, Jerry, I was walking on the beach, and there's a guy that visits from Canada several times a year during the cold seasons. And we just started talking, and he was like, everything you're saying is so brilliant. I've never heard any of this before. And I was like, oh yeah, well, you got to hear about Jerry Marzinsky, because he started talking about these different things. And his son's diagnosed schizophrenic, and all he wants to do is sit in a chair and stare at a wall. And I said, okay, well, here's Jerry's website, send him an email. A couple months
keep
later.
In mind that the cure rate's only about 30% right now. That's fairly low, but it's better than what psychology or psychiatry is getting.
Yeah,
they're not. Nobody's being cured.
Yeah, I told him it wouldn't kill him to ask you a couple of questions, and he agreed. And then a couple months later, he said that he was going to, but his son's not in a place where he wants to be helped, and he's like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, they got to want to help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Nicole, if you want to share your website and stuff, we can wrap this up.
Sure. So my website's drnicoledolan.com, and you can come find me on Instagram if you'd like at Dr. Nicole Dolan.
Awesome. This has been a fantastic conversation for anyone listening, because we just want to help. And sometimes letting people know that there are solutions outside the mainstream narrative that can help, can give them that additional layer of hope and, make them ask better questions. So thanks, Jerry, for being on the Boundless Authenticity podcast. And thank you, Nicole, for building a great episode today.
Yeah, Nicole, if you want to talk to the chief trainer, she'd be glad to talk with you. I could get you, write me, I'll send you her email address.
Sure.
Otherwise, there's more information on jerrymarzinsky.com with people who've recovered, and also some more information about MACE.
Yeah, I'm just very excited to hear that there's somebody that's working with this population in this way. I think that that's a huge blessing to so many people. So
yeah, there's a small group of us that are trying different things that, it's amazing. We're finding stuff, so it's like, hey, this works, or this doesn't work. I mean, but still, it's still fairly small success rate, but it's better than psychiatry.
Fantastic.